The people of Dellwood Crossing called it the Ark, not as a compliment. They said it the way people say things when they want to make sure you know you're being laughed at. Dropping the word into conversations at the feed store, at the diner on Route 9, across church parking lots on Sunday mornings, while the gravel was still wet from the sprinklers. You see what old Harker's building up on that ridge again? Looks like he's expecting Noah's flood. And then the laughter, easy and comfortable, the kind that bonds people together the way shared mockery always does. Nolan Harker had spent 22 years in the United States Army. He'd done 2 tours in the Gulf, 1 in Afghanistan, and a final posting in South Korea that he rarely talked about. He came back to Dellwood Crossing because it was where he'd grown up, because his father was buried in the cemetery on Millbrook Road, and because he didn't know where else a man like him was supposed to go when the war was finally, officially over. He bought the Ridge property for almost nothing. 12 acres of rocky hillside that nobody wanted because you couldn't farm it, and the access road washed out every spring. He paid cash, moved into the old hunting cabin that sat on the highest point of the land, and spent the first winter just watching. That was what his neighbors didn't understand. They saw the building and the digging and the hauling of materials up that rutted road, and they called it obsession. They didn't see the watching that came before it. Nolan had spent the better part of a year studying that ridge the way he used to study terrain maps. Where the water ran when it rained hard, where the wind came from in January, which trees had root systems deep enough to hold the slope, which ones were dead and waiting to fall. He walked the perimeter every morning with his dog, a big brindle hound mix named Ridgeback, that he'd pulled from the county shelter 3 months after moving back. Ridgeback was 11 years old now, gray around the muzzle, slow on cold mornings, but his nose still worked better than any instrument Nolan had ever trusted. The 2 of them walked the land. Nolan watched and thought and built. He started with the drainage. 12 inches of rain in 36 hours could turn that hillside into a river if the water had nowhere to go. So he spent 2 full summers cutting channels, laying perforated pipe, rerouting the natural flow of the land into 3 collection cisterns he'd sunk into the bedrock behind the cabin. People drove past the ridge road and saw the trenches and shook their heads. Doomsday prepper, they said. Crazy old vet up there getting ready for the end of the world. His neighbor to the south, a man named Wendell Cruz, who ran a small engine repair shop off the highway, stopped by one afternoon in early October with a six-pack of beer and what he probably thought was a friendly warning. He stood at the bottom of Nolan's porch steps, looked up at the reinforced shutters on the windows, the generator housing bolted to the concrete pad beside the cabin, the stacks of lumber under the tarp along the tree line, and he said, "Nolan, people are starting to wonder about you." Nolan took the beer. He offered Wendell a chair. They sat on the porch for a while, and he tried to explain. He said he wasn't preparing for the end of the world. He was preparing for Tuesday, for the next hard winter, for the kind of thing that happened all the time in places like this. A bad ice storm, a grid failure, a flood that came up faster than the county's aging levee system could handle. He'd grown up here. He remembered the flood of 1987 that put 4 feet of water in the lower neighborhoods. He remembered the ice storm in 1993 that left people without power for 11 days in January. People forget, Nolan said. Wendell nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're not really listening. He finished his beer, said something polite, and drove back down the ridge road. By the following Sunday, the story at the diner was that Nolan Harker had a bunker up there, with a year's worth of freeze-dried food and enough ammunition to hold off a small army. That wasn't true. But the truth was harder to explain, and Dellwood Crossing had always preferred a good story to an accurate one. Ridgeback found the injured fox in November. It was a small thing, a young red fox that had gotten its back leg caught in a piece of old fencing wire in the cedar break along the east side of the property. Ridgeback stood over it, not barking, just waiting. the way he always waited when he found something that needed detention. Nolan heard him whine once from 200 yards away and walked over to find the dog standing perfectly still, his big head lowered, his eyes tracking Nolan's approach. The fox was terrified. It snapped at Nolan twice when he reached for it. He got his jacket around it anyway, held it steady, cut the wire with his multi-tool, checked the leg, not broken, just badly abraded, and then carried it up to the cabin where he kept a basic veterinary kit alongside his medical supplies. He cleaned the wound. He wrapped it. He kept the fox in a cardboard box by the wood stove for 3 days, feeding it scraps of meat until the leg was stable enough for release. Ridgeback slept beside the box the entire time. It was the kind of thing that happens on a piece of land when you're paying attention, when you walk it every day, and you know it well enough to notice what doesn't belong. Nolan had been paying attention to this land for 6 years now. He knew where the deer bedded in bad weather, knew which corner of the north pasture flooded first, knew exactly how long it took for the temperature to drop 5 degrees after the sun cleared the western ridge. The people in town didn't know any of that. They knew what they could see from the road, and what they saw looked strange. That winter, someone spray-painted the words Bunker Hill on the boulder at the bottom of his access road. Nolan left it there. He figured the name wasn't entirely wrong. The spring was wet, wetter than any Nolan could remember in recent years. The Little Cass River, which ran through the valley below Dellwood Crossing, came up in March and stayed up through April. It didn't flood, not quite, but it sat 3 feet above its normal level for 6 weeks, and Nolan watched it from the ridge every morning, the way a doctor watches a patient's vitals. Not alarmed, not panicked, just watching. He added a 4th cistern that spring. He reinforced the retaining wall on the north slope. He spent 2 weeks in June rebuilding the access road with a drainage crown that would keep it passable, even if the surrounding ground turned to mud. Wendell Krause saw him working on the road from the highway and stopped his truck. He called out from the window. "You expecting a flood, Harker?" Nolan kept tamping gravel. "I'm expecting Tuesday," he said. Wendell laughed and drove on. The summer was ordinary. Hot, dry, the kind of August that made people forget about the wet spring. The Little Cass dropped back to its banks. People in Dellwood Crossing went about their lives. The diner stayed busy. The high school football team won their first 3 games, and the general mood of the valley was that things were fine and getting finer. In September, Nolan drove down to the valley twice a week to pick up supplies and to walk through town. He bought groceries from Mace's Market on Fulton Street, got his truck serviced at the shop on the highway, occasionally stopped at the hardware store for materials. People were polite in the way that small towns are polite. A nod, a hello, a brief exchange about the weather. Nobody was unfriendly to his face. He was just the strange old vet on the ridge, a story people told about this town, not quite part of it anymore. He'd made his peace with that. The only person in town who treated him the same way she always had was a woman named Dorothy Pace, who ran the small public library on the corner of Fulton and 2nd. Dorothy was 73 years old, built like a sparrow, and had taught 4th grade in Dellwood Crossing for 31 years before retiring to the library. She didn't care what people thought of Nolan's Ridge. She cared that he returned his books on time, and that he had good things to say about the ones he liked. They'd been trading book recommendations for 5 years, and she was the person in this valley Nolan trusted most, though he would never have said so out loud. She was also the person who, in the first week of October, mentioned casually from behind the circulation desk that the county hydrologist had filed a report about the Little Cass Basin, and that the report apparently wasn't encouraging. "I wouldn't know where to find a thing like that," Nolan said. "Third shelf, municipal documents." "Left side," Dorothy said, without looking up. He read it twice. Then he drove back up to the ridge and spent the rest of the week doing calculations he'd been hoping he wouldn't need to do. The rain started on a Wednesday, not dramatically, just gray sky in the morning, a light drizzle by noon, steady rain by late afternoon. the kind of rain that felt ordinary at first. The forecast called for 2 to 3 inches over 3 days, which wasn't unusual for October in the valley. By Thursday morning it was 4 inches and still coming. Nolan was up before dawn, walking the perimeter with Ridgeback, checking the drainage channels, testing the cistern overflow valves, watching the runoff. The ground was already saturated from the wet spring and summer. It had nowhere to put more water. He could see it sheeting off the hillside in thin silver channels, finding its way downhill with the patient, indifferent determination that water always has. He turned on the weather radio at 6 in the morning and listened to the overnight revision in the forecast. The storm system had stalled. The new estimate was 6 to 8 inches over 4 days. He called Dorothy Pace at 7. "I know," she said before he could say anything. "I've been listening to the radio since 4. "The lower neighborhoods," he said. "I know," she said again. He packed supplies into his truck: medical kit, dry blankets, food, water, extra fuel for the generator. He added 2 large tarpaulins and 100 feet of rope. Ridgeback watched him load the truck from the porch, tail moving slowly, reading the morning the way he always did. Then Nolan drove down into Dellwood Crossing. The river was already rising. He could see it from the highway. The little Cass was brown and fast and carrying debris, chunks of bark and stripped branches that rolled in the current like dark hands. He drove through town slowly, watching the water in the drainage ditches, watching the way it collected in the low corners of the intersections, not flooding yet, but filling. He stopped at the diner on Route 9. Inside, it was warm and ordinary. Coffee smell, breakfast plates, the morning news murmuring from the television above the counter. People looked up when he came in. He recognized most of them, faces from the feed store, from the hardware store, from Sunday mornings in the church parking lot. The conversation slowed when he walked to the counter. He ordered coffee. He sat down, he said as evenly as he could manage, that the little Cass was going to flood, that the county hydrologist's report from October had projected a high water event if the basin received more than 5 inches in a 4-day period, and that they were going to hit that number by tomorrow morning. He said the lower neighborhoods, Sycamore Street, the blocks along Millbrook Road, the trailer park on the east side near the river bend, needed to know. There was a silence. Then a man named Owen Ferris, who owned the hardware store and had been in Dellwood Crossing his entire life, said, "The little Cass hasn't flooded since '87. That was a different situation entirely." Nolan said, "The basin drainage characteristics have changed significantly since '87. The wetlands on the north side were developed in 1998. There's no buffer anymore." Owen Ferris looked at him for a moment and said, very quietly, "Harker, nobody's flooding. You go back up to your bunker and let us handle things down here." The diner went back to its coffee and its breakfast plates. Nolan finished his coffee. He left money on the counter. He drove to the lower neighborhoods and spent the next 6 hours going door to door. Most people were polite. Some were less so. A man on Sycamore Street told him to get off his property. A woman on Millbrook Road listened carefully, asked 2 or 3 good questions, and said she'd talk to her husband. A group of teenagers at the trailer park thought it was funny. But a few people listened. An elderly couple named Victor and Stella Brandt, who had lived on the low end of Millbrook Road for 40 years and remembered 1987 clearly, started moving things to their second floor before Nolan was done talking. A young woman named Pam Everett, who lived alone in the trailer park with her 7-year-old son and her old basset hound, went pale when Nolan described the potential water levels and immediately began pulling boxes from her closet. Nolan helped Pam move what he could in his truck: the boy's bicycle, the dog's crate, a box of documents, some food. She had nowhere obvious to go. He told her she could come up to the ridge if it came to that. He gave her his number. She wrote it on her hand with a marker, the way people do when they're genuinely scared. He got back to the ridge at dusk. The rain had not stopped. It had, if anything, intensified in the afternoon. Not a downpour, just a relentless, heavy gray curtain that came down in waves. Ridgeback met him at the truck, sniffed his boots, and turned back toward the cabin without ceremony. The generator was running, the wood stove was lit. Nolan ate something simple, drank coffee, and sat with the weather radio until midnight. By midnight, the forecast had been revised again. 8 to 10 inches, possible localized flooding in low-lying areas. The county had issued a watch, not a warning. The difference, at this stage, was mostly semantic. He slept 4 hours. He was up again at 4 in the morning. The little cask crested at 11:17 on Friday morning. Nolan knew the exact time because he'd been watching the river gauge on the county flood monitoring website, refreshing it every 20 minutes since before dawn. The gauge at the Route 9 bridge read 14.2 feet at 11:17, which was 2.8 feet above the flood stage threshold and 0.4 feet below the level recorded in 1987. The lower neighborhoods flooded. It happened fast once it started. That was the thing people never understood until they saw it. The water didn't creep. It came in like something that had been waiting. Sycamore Street went under in 40 minutes. Millbrook Road, lower section, was knee-deep by noon. The trailer park on the East Bend took water from both sides at once, the river from the east and the backed-up drainage from the west, and within 2 hours the road in was impassable. Nolan's phone began ringing at noon. The first call was from Pam Everett. Her voice was flat with the specific kind of calm that sets in when panic has already run its course, and the only thing left is whatever comes next. She said the water was at her door. She said her son was fine. She said the basset hound had gotten out somehow and she couldn't find him. "I'll come down," Nolan said. "The road's flooded," she said. "The main road in is underwater. There's a second way," he said. "Give me 40 minutes. He'd found the second way 2 years ago, walking the land on a Sunday morning. A logging track that ran along the backside of the trailer park, elevated above the flood plain by about 6 feet, accessible from the county road on the south side. He'd driven it twice in his truck to make sure it held. He hadn't told anyone about it because there'd been no reason to. There was a reason now. Ridgeback stood up from his spot by the wood stove and walked to the door. Nolan looked at him. The dog was 11 years old. His hips were bad. The rain was cold. "Stay," Nolan said. Ridgeback sat down. His eyes tracked Nolan to the door. Then, as Nolan stepped outside, the dog stood up again. He didn't bark, he didn't push past. He just stood in the doorway with the rain coming down around him, looking at Nolan with the particular expression he'd had since he was young. The one that said he had already made his own decision about this and wasn't interested in negotiating. Nolan held the truck door open. Ridgeback climbed in. The logging track held. It was slick with mud, and the truck slid twice on the steeper sections. But the tires found purchase, and they made it through to the back side of the trailer park in 38 minutes. The scene was worse than Nolan had prepared for, which was saying something, because he'd prepared for bad. 14 trailers in the park. 7 of them had water inside. 3 families were on their roofs. One older man, a retired railroad worker named Chet Dobbins, who'd lived in the same trailer for 16 years, was sitting in a lawn chair on top of his unit with a fishing hat on, watching the water with an expression of resigned irritation, as if the flood were a plumbing problem he'd reported 3 times and nobody had fixed. There were 12 people in the park. Nolan got them out in 4 trips along the logging track, the truck bed loaded with people and their most essential things, Ridgeback riding in the cab taking up more than his share of the seat. On the second trip, Ridgeback started barking. This was unusual enough that Nolan braked immediately. The dog was looking toward the tree line on the south side of the track, a dense stand of cedar that bordered the logging road, barking in the short, specific way he barked when he'd found something that didn't fit. Nolan stopped the truck, told the 3 people in the back to wait. He got out in the rain and followed the dog into the trees. The basset hound was there. He'd gotten himself wedged under a root mass trying to get out of the water, his back end submerged, his front paws scrabbling at the mud. He was exhausted and shaking, and would have gone under within the hour. Nolan pulled him out, carried him back to the truck. The boy in the cab, Pam Everett's son, whose name was Jake, who was 7 years old, and had not cried once through any of this, pressed his face against the wet fur and did not say anything. Ridgeback lay down beside them and put his head on Jake's knee. The last 2 trips brought the remaining residents up the logging track, and eventually, when it became clear that the county shelters were already overwhelmed and that the main roads wouldn't be passable until the water receded, up the ridge road to Nolan's cabin. 14 people, 3 dogs, counting Ridgeback and the Basset Hound, and a small black terrier that belonged to Chet Dobbins. Most of them had never been this far up the ridge before. Some of them had been among the people who called it the Ark. The cabin was not large, but the generator was running and the wood stove was hot, and there was food, and Nolan had built the main room with a deliberate open plan, because he'd always understood, on some level, that the person who prepares is the person who eventually has people coming through the door. He didn't say this to anyone. Victor and Stella Brandt arrived in the early afternoon, having driven out the South County Road before it closed. Stella walked into the cabin, looked around at the stored supplies, the organized medical kit on the wall, the stacked firewood in the covered passage beside the door, and she said quietly to Victor, "He knew." Victor nodded. The young woman from Millbrook Road, the one who'd asked good questions, arrived an hour later with her husband and her 2 kids. Her husband was a man named Bobby Daines, who worked at the grain elevator, and who had, in a conversation at the feed store the previous spring, referred to Nolan Harker as a textbook case of PTSD with a construction hobby. Bobby Daines walked into the cabin, looked at the generator, looked at the wood stove, looked at the stacked blankets and the food, and the first aid supplies organized on labeled shelves, and said nothing at all for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need me to do?" And that was the thing about Nolan Harker. He'd spent 22 years learning that the fastest way to move through a hard situation is to put people to work, and so he handed Bobby Daines a flashlight and a list and told him to take inventory of the dry goods in the storage room, because they were going to need to know exactly what they had if this went longer than 2 days. Bobby didn't ask questions. He went. Owen Ferris from the hardware store arrived at 4 in the afternoon, muddy to his waist, his truck having gotten stuck a quarter-mile down the ridge road. Before Nolan went back down in his own truck to pull him out, Owen sat on the porch steps in the rain while Nolan hooked up the tow chain, and he said without turning around, "I told you nobody was flooding." "You did," Nolan said. "I was wrong." "You were." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've lived in this valley my whole life. I know you have. I've never seen it flood like this." Nolan said, "People forget. That's not a character flaw. It's just how people are." He pulled the truck forward. The chain went taut. Owen's truck lurched free of the mud with a sucking sound. "Come on up to the cabin," Nolan said. "There's coffee." Dorothy Pace arrived last, at 5:30, driven up by her neighbor's son in a 4-wheel drive. She walked into the cabin, counted heads, inventoried the situation in the way that only retired 4th-grade teachers and former soldiers can, and immediately took over the organization of the kitchen. Nobody argued with her. She also, without being asked, set up a corner of the main room with a folding table and some crayons she produced from her bag, and she sat down with Jake and 2 other children and began, in the most ordinary possible voice, to tell them a story. It was a story she was clearly inventing as she went. Something about a bear who built a house that everyone thought was too big until the winter came. And the children sat with her completely still, even Ridgeback settling in at the edge of the table, as though he'd been appointed official story listener. The rain went on through Friday night. It let up on Saturday morning and stopped entirely by Saturday afternoon. The water in the lower neighborhoods began to recede by Sunday, slowly and imperfectly, leaving behind the particular mud and debris signature of a flood. The water lines on walls, the scattered contents of closets, the smell that doesn't go away for weeks. 7 homes in the lower neighborhoods had sustained significant damage. The trailer park was a write-off for the season. Nobody had been seriously hurt, Nobody had drowned. The county shelter had taken in 40 people. Nolan's cabin had taken in 14, which was, as Dorothy Pace noted while doing the arithmetic over coffee on Sunday morning, a higher per square foot efficiency rate than the official emergency management response. "Don't tell them that," Nolan said. "Why not? It'll just make them feel bad." Dorothy considered this. "You're kinder than people give you credit for," she said. "Don't tell them that either." The water receded slowly. People left the ridge in ones and twos as the roads cleared. Bobby Danes first with his family, stopping at the door long enough to shake Nolan's hand and say something he seemed to mean. The young couple from Millbrook Road, who'd spent 3 days sleeping on the cabin floor. Chet Dobbins, who'd been surprisingly excellent company, and had strong opinions about fly fishing that Nolan found genuinely interesting. Owen Ferris left on Sunday evening. He stood at the truck for a long time before getting in, looking back at the cabin on the ridge, the same cabin he'd probably driven past 100 times without thinking much about it. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead," Nolan said. "When you came into the diner, when you tried to tell us." Owen stopped. "You knew we weren't going to listen." Nolan thought about this honestly. "I hoped you might," he said. "But you came anyway." "I came anyway." Owen looked down at the gravel. "Why?" It was a real question. Nolan thought about how to answer it without making a speech, because he'd never been a speech kind of person. He thought about the ridge, and the 6 years of walking it, and Ridgeback aging beside him year by year, and the county hydrologist's report sitting on the library shelf that nobody had read, and the flood line from 1987 he'd marked on a tree down by the river the first spring he'd lived here, checking it every year, watching the river remember things that people forgot. "Because you live here," Nolan said. "Same as me." Owen got in his truck. He drove down the ridge road slowly, the way people drive when they're thinking about something. Pam, Everett, and Jake were the last to leave. On Monday morning, the trailer park was going to take weeks to sort out, and she didn't know yet where they'd go in the meantime. But her sister in Cedar Falls had a spare room, and the county had assistance programs. She stood in the cabin doorway with Jake beside her, the basset hound under his arm. The dog had recovered completely and was already showing signs of his characteristic ability to take up more physical space than his size warranted. "I don't know how to thank you," Pam said. "You wrote your number on your hand," Nolan said. That took nerve. She smiled at that, a real smile, the first he'd seen from her since this started. Jake looked up at Ridgeback, who was standing beside Nolan with his tail moving in a slow arc. "Is he going to be okay?" Jake asked. He meant the dog. He also might have meant something else. Nolan put his hand on Ridgeback's back, felt the old dog lean into it. "He's going to be fine," Nolan said. "He just needs to stay warm and eat well and take it easy for a while." Jake considered this with the gravity that 7-year-olds bring to serious information. "That's what my grandpa said when he got out of the hospital," Jake said. "Smart grandpa," Nolan said. They drove away down the ridge road. Nolan watched the truck until it disappeared around the first bend in the trees. The boulder at the bottom of the access road still said, "Bunker Hill" in faded spray paint. Nolan walked past it most mornings with Ridgeback, the dog checking the perimeter, the two of them moving through the land the way they always had, slowly, attentively, without hurry. The drainage channels had performed exactly as designed. The cisterns were full. The cabin had stood through 3 days of continuous rain without a single point of failure that Nolan hadn't anticipated and planned for. None of that had been an accident. In November, the County Emergency Management Office sent him a letter. It thanked him, in the careful language of official correspondence, for his assistance during the flooding event of October, and noted that his local knowledge had contributed to a positive outcome for residents of the lower valley. It was signed by a deputy director Nolan had never met. He pinned it to the wall of the storage room next to the maintenance schedule for the generator. Dorothy Pace stopped by in early December, which she sometimes did, with a bag of books she thought he should read, and a container of cookies she claimed were just getting in her way at home. She sat at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the ridge, the bare trees, the sky going pale in the west. "People are talking about you differently now," she said. "I imagine they are," Nolan said. "Does that matter to you?" He thought about it, really thought about it, the way you do when someone you respect asks something that deserves an honest answer. "A little," he said. "Less than it used to." Dorothy nodded. She opened one of the books she'd brought, a history of the Ohio River floods of the early 20th century, which she knew he'd read twice already, but thought he might want his own copy of, and pushed it across the table. "The little Cass," she said, "is going to do it again someday. I know. Are you going to be ready?" Ridgeback lifted his head from the floor, looked at Nolan, put his head back down. "That's the plan," Nolan said. Outside, the ridge held the last of the afternoon light. The cisterns were full. The firewood was stacked. The channels ran clear. The cabin on the hill had not been built for the end of the world. It had been built for Tuesday, for the specific, ordinary, inevitable Tuesday when the water comes up and someone needs a door that is still open. That door was still open. It would be.